I'm Chris Garcia, and I'm going to be talking about Week 10 subject on LGBTQ. My current event presentation is going to be based off of the reading The X in Latinx is a wound, not a trend. And just by the title, I did not even know what Latinx was. So, I Googled it, and it turns out a lot of, if not the majority of Hispanic people don't even know what the word Latinx means. You Google it and it says about 3%. So before I even did the reading, I wanted to know what Latinx was, and it's basically the English equivalent of the pronoun they. So it neutralizes gender in the Spanish language. And the overall thesis of the article is that the Latinx, the actual X, is more of a wound, meaning it's caused more damage that's been tolerated by the Hispanic culture on transgender and non-gender conforming individuals. And this article sheds light on the history of this pronoun rather than trying to expand its awareness. It's rather shedding light on the history of what the Latinx identity conveys. So, the author, the writer of this article actually personally lost a friend, a transgender friend, it was a femicide, and that's basically how he starts his the article. And he goes on to describe the X in the name. He's trying to have that be a representation of 4 markers that are not 4 markers of history that should be included in that pronoun. And by included, I mean community members that identify with this ought to know the history of this, of the X, the Latinidad community. Basically, the writer wants the reader to understand that this X is a label of approval that Latin Americans have used to neutralize gender, and that even though it's being accepted, it's rather leaving out the history of how this term Latinidad and Latinx came to be. So the 4 X's, the 4 corners of the X are used, the writer uses them as 4 separate explanations. The first X, he titles it the wound of settlement, which basically represents the history that comes with a Latinidad identity, which is through settler colonialism. That understanding that first X marker, you have he wants us to understand that first X represents settlement of how the Latinidad identity even began. And that settlement that he's referring to refers to the 500-year-old history of Columbus, when he, came and conquered indigenous people of what is now known as Haiti and the DR, the Dominican Republic. That's an important topic that must be included in just Latin American history. The second X he uses is to represent the repercussions of Latinx and anti-blackness. The term Latinx is used to neutralize gender and be more inclusive, but history forgets to include that a majority of this history is failing to include darker skin tone Hispanics, people of darker color. The slave trade is basically based like the slave trade that happened in Latin America, Southern America. It fails to include that these people are also considered and ought to be more included in Latinx identification. The X represents that acceptance of leaving out the history, basically tolerating it in a way, and it's unfair overall because people that identify with Latinx, when you're lighter skin toned, they don't get questioned as much. They don't experience the same police encounterments and doubts on whether they are Latinx or not. If you're lighter skin tone and you look Hispanic, okay, but when you're darker, you're automatically pressed more. It's systematic. It's racial profiling. It's systematic racism, and the author basically wants to shed light on how darker skin tone Hispanics are treated differently than lighter skin tone Hispanics. The third X represents the tolerance and acceptance of femicides. Femicides are the intentional gender-based murder of a woman caused by a man. I did not know this until I read the article, and it's eye-opening to realize that it is so much more difficult for transgender, non-gender conforming women to live in southern parts and basically just Latin America overall, I should say. Coming from a Hispanic background, I grew up seeing anyone who was just not straight as weird, and it wasn't it didn't come from me. It's just the way my parents, how they grew up, and that's generational. It passes down. So it's kind of like it correlates with me not knowing too much about this or any at all, and it's it's unfortunate that in our home countries this community of people experience life or death basically anytime they walk out their doorstep. So that's a very much a subject that the writer heavily implies on knowing if you were to be a member of this community. He includes the fact that femicides, the killing of a woman for being a woman, femicides were used by these settlers, and they were specifically targeted because they were slaves, and these hate crimes on femicides, these hate crimes on women are more prevalent than we even know about. So definitely trying to shed light on that when people refer to or want to know about the term Latinx. And the fourth X of the actual X, the fourth marker, is inarticulation. lots of times our parents have to explain something to us in Spanish because that's the only way we'll understand. And that inarticulation to put what it's like living through, this day and age of accepting people for their pronouns and, all that. It's that loss of words for explaining what it's like going through that. That's the inarticulation that's happening. The writer uses an example of his mom just telling him in Spanish, "Hay que tener cuidado." And he kind of just, when we hear that, if you speak Spanish and you hear that, not much needs to be said. You understand what they mean by tener cuidado. It's just two words, but we understand what it means. And that is like that inarticulation is basically like, I would say, a flaw in a way in the identity's history. And that's what the writer sheds light on. So the 4X's were, the first one was the wound of settlement, the second one was the wound of anti-blackness, the third one was the wound of femicides, and the fourth wound was the wound of inarticulation. The first one talked about like the history of kind of where indigenous people began to feel that like rise of identity being stripped away from them. The second one was on anti-blackness, meaning the separation of lighter and darker skin tone Hispanics and how they're treated differently. The third X was the wound of femicides, which shed the history on homicides on women. And then the fourth one was inarticulation, the wound of inarticulation, meaning sometimes we don't have the word to describe what it's like living through this, unfortunately, like this day and age where women are still being targeted for being transgender and gender nonconforming. And yeah, that's basically it. My research was mostly dependent on this article. Like I said, I chose this topic because I feel like when I was living in Sacramento, I was around way more activism, and just being on campus allowed me to be more intellectually curious about what is Latinx or about the LGBTQ community or activism. It's the whole reason why I moved up there. Being down here in LA, although it's LA, I feel like my knowledge on this is becoming less and less relevant because it's like it doesn't get talked around a lot in Hispanic communities, and definitely not in this household. And I know lots of my friends and family members that are in the same situation where they, their younger kids know about these things, but there's no support for expanding that knowledge. So I thought that this would be a great topic for me to, keep my mind, keep my mind going on wanting to learn more about the LGBTQ and activism. And yeah, that's pretty much it.